Grace and peace to you from the one who was, and is to come. Amen. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." Thanks to stunning wildlife documentaries, we're able to witness the power of homing instincts. Salmon are said to dare a 3,000-kilometer journey home. They depart from the depths of the oceans and make their way upstream to the creeks and rivers of their birth. Seabirds, like their Arctic terns, are said to migrate 35,000 kilometers every year between the Arctic and the Antarctic. And then there are, of course, the Great Migration, the largest mammal migration on Earth. About 2 million wildebeest beginning their 800-kilometer journey in the south of the Serengeti. Having given birth to about 500,000 calves during the wet season between January and March, the wildebeest are then forced to move in search for greener pastures, following a clockwise movement from the south, west, north, and back to the south. It is a migration not without tremendous risks. It involves crossing of rivers with thousands of crocodiles and facing the famous Serengeti lion population. The Great Migration is a powerful example of the circle of life and the longing to return home. Humans also find themselves on such journeys of homecoming. But for us, it is not so much a biological journey as it is a spiritual journey. There can be crucial junctures in our lives when the pull towards our home base becomes irresistible. Naomi Rosenblatt describes it as a gravitational attraction. It applies to a student returning home during a study break as much as to soldiers returning from war. For some of us, such return is linked to a desire to reconnect with our roots. Others again return to find healing and make peace with their past. We know of mythic heroes said to have undergone a dangerous passage on their way home, often after a long period of exile. In Homer's Odyssey, for example, the hero Odysseus battles his way home from the Trojan War. It is a 10-year-long journey on which he has to face gods, demigods, and sorceresses. The Bible knows about such homing instincts and the arduous journey it involves. Abraham's grandson Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah, has his own story of homecoming to tell. Second-born to his fraternal twin brother Esau, he is said to have bought Esau's birthright, and with his mother's help deceived his aging father Isaac to bless him instead of Esau. Jacob's name derives from the Hebrew word for heel, recalling how he tried to grasp the heel of his twin brother Esau already at birth. Having grasped for his brother's birthright and his father's blessing, Jacob finds himself on the run. Jacob's path is not lined with jealous gods and sorceresses, as in Odysseus' case. In her book, Wrestling with Angels, Naomi Rosenblatt beautifully illustrates how Jacob has to rather navigate an obstacle course of competing wives, a rapacious uncle, a wronged brother, and his own guilty conscience. The path he has to charter is complex, burdened with intellectual, emotional, moral, and spiritual challenges. It takes him 20 years to find a safe passage home and to be no longer driven by self-interest and the need for affirmation. In contrast to the prodigal son in Jesus' parable, Jacob does not choose to leave. He has no option but to flee. But it also offers him an opportunity for personal growth and maturity. Such leaving home does not necessarily have to involve geographical distance. Children have to distance themselves from their parents in order to find their own place in the world. Jacob's flight was also an escape from an overprotective mother and a distant father. The fact that the parents each had their favorite son intensified the sibling rivalry. But the time comes when one is drawn back home to either recharge one's emotional and spiritual batteries or to work through and resolve past conflicts and trauma. Such stock-taking is about identity and self-worth. It is as much about reaching out as it is about the ongoing need to negotiate boundaries. By now, Jacob's mother and father have been buried in the soil of the promised land at the cave of Machpelah. But Jacob feels a strong need to overcome past family rivalry and make peace with his brother. Such revisiting also applies to divine promises and covenants made in the past. God's covenant with the one and not the other should not be confused with favoritism. God's choice of Jacob, a selfish and deceitful anti-hero, already signals that such choice is not based on merit or virtue. Such divine chosenness is also not meant to fuel attitudes of superiority, but is rather intended to engender responsibility and model maturity of heart and mind. Remember how Abraham and Sarah were chosen in order to be a blessing for the world, so that one day all would feel chosen and blessed by God. Jacob is to take his place and embrace the promise given to his ancestors. Such leadership is about leading by example. It is not about exercising power over others, but rather empowering others to find their place and role in God's vision of shalom for the world. But Jacob has to first embark on his own spiritual quest before he is able to fill the place and role in God's history with humankind. He who tried to grasp for the blessing has to learn how to receive it from the one he stole it from. Today's biblical passage takes us to the brink of his return to the land of his birth. It is a moment marked by a climatic confrontation, not only with his twin brother Esau, but also with all the unresolved conflicts and his troubled past. The closer he gets to his place of birth, the more vulnerable and fearful he becomes. Materially speaking, he has done well for himself. Now a middle-aged man, Jacob is finally free from his uncle Laban and able to consider to return to his homeland with his family, an extensive flock, and take up the leadership of his clan. Though he had stolen the blessing, he is expected to wear the mantle of the covenant that God and his father had bestowed on him. But Naomi Rosenblatt observes how the frightened boy within him is still groping for the courage to face his big brother. As he gets closer to home, he decides to send messengers to Esau in order to announce his return, but also to let him know that he has made well for himself and acquired the wealth of cattle, donkeys, sheep, and servants. But the message he receives on their return only confirms his worst fears. We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Jacob now fears the worst. In order to protect his small tribe of 100 unarmed people, he divides his family and the flocks, herds, and camels into 2 camps. If Esau attacks the one camp, the other might be able to escape. Then he returns to God in prayer and acknowledges his unworthiness of God's kindness and faithfulness. But he also reminds the God of Abraham and Isaac of the promise made to him to make him prosper and grant him descendants like the sand of the sea. After a restless night, he takes another measure in the hope of appeasing his brother. He sends his servants with hand-picked herds and flocks ahead of him to meet Esau and offer them as a gift to him. Jacob is a tactical survivor. He does not simply wait for God to take action and protect him and his family. He does what lies in his powers to improve the chances of their survival. His distress does not paralyze him, but he also does no longer try to outwit his brother. His hope is to appease him by offering him lavish gifts of livestock and not to clearly signal his willingness to surrender himself. He assumes full responsibility, takes action, and trusts God to give him the strength of heart and mind to face this precarious and uncertain situation. His surrender to God is not passive, but active and intentional. It reminds me of Reinhold Niebuhr's famous prayer for serenity. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Jacob still needs to fully realize that he does not find himself between a rock and a hard place, but between the dream of a mysterious ladder lowered into his life and a wrestling match that would test the limits of his courage and faith. The very same night he arrives at the river Jabbok, Jacob sends his family and all his possessions across the river. He himself remains behind. Now he is alone at the shores of the Jabbok. This might be his last night, and he needs it for himself to take stock of his gains and losses. It is during the night, when all alone, that we are able to meet our worst fears and deepest wishes. In our search for guidance, we either reach deep within ourselves or plead with a higher power for comfort. In those moments, we will discover if we are all alone, or rather in the company of our ancestors, our personal angels, or our God. At this stage, Jacob does not know his brother's intent. Only the next morning will show, but the night allows him to take stock of where he has been and what he has become. He's ready to face what is haunting his waking and sleeping soul. The ground is hard, and the campfires across the river are still burning. He has to think of his father's blind embrace, the dream he had of a ladder descending from heaven, and the disheartening surprise in the wedding chamber. What would await him the next morning? A fateful reckoning? Throughout time, crossing a river symbolized an important personal threshold experience. For Jacob, the river Jabbok clearly signals more than a geographical border. Rosenblatt describes it as a spiritual divide between his youth and his adult self, between his doubt and his faith in his own destiny. The river's name, Jabbok, is closely related to the Hebrew word meaning to wrestle. Jacob has arrived at a point in his life where he has to face and wrestle with his personal demons. Will he be able to pin them down and leave them behind as he crosses over to the other side of the shore? So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Without any warning, Jacob finds himself wrestling with what the text simply describes as a man. But who is this man with whom Jacob wrestles until the break of dawn, until he blesses him with a new name? Is it his departed father, Isaac? It is from him that he tried to wrest a blessing. Or is it his twin brother Esau? With him he wrestled already in the womb. Or is it Jacob's shadow self? Fears and doubts, guilt and despair surface to be engaged and integrated. Or is it an angel of death confronting him with the fear of his own mortality? The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber encourages us to consider Jacob's wrestling match as a metaphor for all of humanity struggling with life's existential questions. But at some stage, Jacob must have realized that he's wrestling with an angel of God, forcing him to confront his worldly ambitions and discover his deeper desire for love and acceptance, which underlies his pursuit for wealth and power. Is this God's way of reminding him of his spiritual destiny? What if the man is a kind of incarnation of all of these figures and forces in his life? Naomi Rosenblatt's insight is striking. The withholding father gives way to the contentious brothers, who finally yields to the angel of God, a messenger announcing Jacob's new spiritual identity. Jacob is determined to not let go of the man unless he's blessed. This time he stands his ground rather than running away, and the man's response is as revealing as it is concealing. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. After decades of humiliation and flight, Jacob finally received the blessing he once sought in his father's tent. It is a turning point in his life. From being a passive player in the drama of his destiny, he is now able to assume control and responsibility. He is no longer at war with himself, no longer the frightened child. Having prevailed over his past, he is now rewarded with a new name, a new identity, and a renewed vision for his future. Jacob names the place Peniel, which in Hebrew literally means face of God or vision of God. The name marks the place as one of those thin places where the divide between heaven and earth, past, present, and future, is but a very thin line. And so Jacob explains his choice of Peniel as the name that would help future generations to remember this extraordinary encounter. It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. Marc Chagall's golden rooster announces a new morning. He's no longer the one who grasps at his brother's gifts and his father's love. He has now become Israel, the prevailer, who, to speak with Rosenblatt, earns his blessing through sheer doggedness, but clinging to his faith with all his might and refusing to let go. As the sun rises, he passes Peniel, but he's walking with a limp. He's no longer running from his past. And even though his trials are far from over, from now on, he will not lose faith in his calling and purpose in life. Crossing the river with a hip still throbbing with pain, he rejoins his wives and children. But Esau is fast approaching with 400 men. Jacob steps forward and bows low to the ground 7 times. And to his surprise, he sees Esau running towards him to greet, embrace, and kiss him. And both start weeping. He has wrestled with God face to face, but nothing compares to see his brother's face turned towards him. In a moment of profound relief and gratitude, Jacob confesses, "To see your face is like seeing the face of God, and you have received me favorably." It took Jacob 20 years to work through his issues of sibling rivalry. Such reconciliation is not a passive process. It involves the willingness to face the pain, to admit the depth of the hurt caused, to wrestle with one's conscience, to bow down low and beg for forgiveness. Only after years of anguish and painful self-examination could they embrace and weep with relief in each other's arms. According to Elie Wiesel, Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor, Jacob has understood a fundamental truth. God is in human beings, even in suffering, even in misfortune, even in evil. God is everywhere, in every being. God does not wait for human beings at the end of the road, the termination of exile. He accompanies them there. More than that, God is the road. God is the exile. God holds both ends of the rope. God is present in every extremity. God is every limit. God is part of Jacob, as God is part of Esau. And so as you leave from here, as you continue to wrestle with your own past, your own hurt and guilt, shame and pain, as you continue to long for your own homecoming, God bless you and keep you. God's face shine upon you and be gracious to you. God's face be turned towards you and grant you peace. Amen.